Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata here back with you. What a morning it has been. If anybody is going to be joining this live and you catch this, please let me know, make sure that my audio is working. I have had more than a few upsets with this particular live getting it together. Thinking maybe now that the ghost of Henry VIII is not pleased with me. So, with that said, may St. Thomas More, may St. John Fisher, and all of the holy martyr saints of England and Wales help me through this. Would you believe that a few weeks ago when I came up with this talk, somehow saving the notes that I had compiled, the entire file became corrupted and I lost all of it. On top of this rather sad, this is rather sad and tragic for me, just losing like one lecture, but I had an entire file that had stored all of my previous notes and that became corrupted, apparently lost to the sands of time. C'est la vie. I had hoped at one point to compile all of those notes and into like a series of essays, but that seems very much less likely now. I had what I thought was an excellent live to present for you all today, and so having to rewrite the entire thing, I am not so sure that I have improved upon it, but we shall see. This is the cost. I don't back the stuff up on a cloud. I haven't historically. I just haven't prioritized these lives like I should. But it's an incredible blow for any of you guys that have done this, to have something so prepared and then because that's actually one thing that I do. I like prep very well for the notes with the notes that I compile. So to have all of that just sort of go poof when you think that you're good to go is a little bit of a it's I'm not a defeatist or anything. I think I've got a good live for you guys still today. But anyways, we pick up our crosses and we carry on. So today, King Henry VIII. The goal of all of this was to give some historical and theological context to the English Reformation that I see very often lacking in the conversations that Catholics have with Protestants. There are any number of problems with the way that Catholics engage Protestants, but in particular, the way that I see many Catholic apologists, especially engaging Anglicans, I feel like is in need of a serious reassessment. I am by no means an expert in all of the intricacies of the Anglican Catholic dialogue, but I do believe that we can speak to the nuances here a bit in a way that should help you, oh dear listeners, make sense of the reforms in England and how it was both similar and distant from what took place on the continent. The first thing that I had in my notes was to go over with you all was just how all of the initial characters were and who all the initial characters were and how the connections between them helped lead to the eventual rupture. Now, I did kind of streamline this. There's many characters that we're not going to cover in this. I didn't want it. Sometimes that you'll find with the English Reformation, like all of the Thomases get really confusing. Like, are we talking about which Thomas are we talking about here? So I sort of narrowed down some of the characters in an attempt to sort of bring out some of the story, and I think it'll be helpful for you guys. First, in order to understand Henry VIII, you have to consider who his father was, Henry VII, who had only recently defeated Richard III at the infamous battle whereby the War of the Roses has come to an end. This war was a dynastic dispute between, with Richard's demise, the end of the Plantagenet rule in England and the beginnings of the Tudor dynasty. Now, as you probably know, legitimacy is really everything for a monarch. Sheer willpower and determination doesn't cut it. Without some major social upsets, you can, through sheer willpower and determination, rule a people, but it's much more easier if the people accept the legitimacy of your rule. Things go a lot more smoothly. Every ruler once in place wants to legitimize their claim to the throne. And one of the ways you do that is through the marriage of your children, with the alliances you form through that, and the grandchildren that you have. So if I am newly elected or newly recognized king and I want to legitimize my inheritance, I'm wanting to consolidate my dynasty, I may marry off a son or a daughter to a well-established monarch. Then when grandchildren are born, that monarch has a vested interest in seeing my dynasty survive. So Henry VII, realizing this, marries his son Arthur, heir apparent. And remember here, it's not young Henry VIII who would become Henry VIII at the beginning who was heir apparent. It was the older brother, Arthur. Henry VII marries Arthur to the daughter of the Spanish throne. So we need to look at that for a moment. Kind of keep in mind where you're at in history. Keep this in the fore of your minds. In the 15th century, the houses of Castile and Aragon are united with the marriage of Isabel and Ferdinand. By 1492, they have managed to topple Granada, the last of the Muslim powers of Spain, as well as they have opened up the New World at this point. Their daughter is a Catholic, Catherine of Aragon, and it is this Catherine who marries Arthur in England in 1497. Okay, so Isabel, Ferdinand, very well established monarchy. They're kicking the Muslims out of Spain. They're opening up the New World. I, as Henry VII, want to get my son married to their daughter. This will help legitimize my new government. So we're keeping some the like historical context in the fore of this conversation. Even though there had been this internal battle in England between the houses of Lancaster and York, the actual mortal enemy of England at this time was France. It was still France, who they had just spent the better part of a century at war with. Added to all of this, and I know I promised you guys it wasn't going to be full of characters, but we have to get through some of the characters. Added to all of this, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire wanted to forge alliances which would undermine France's hegemony. So marrying off Catherine to Henry's son was the first part of that strategy. The second part of that strategy was to marry their other daughter, Joanna, to Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. And their son would go on to be none other than Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, who would have lasting influences on the events moving forward. But tragically, back in England, Arthur becomes ill and dies, which threatens to undo this entire plan, with the exception that Catherine writes a letter seeking a dispensation as she had not consummated her very quick marriage with Arthur before his demise. So there's a period of negotiations. She's 23. At 23 years old, she is a widow. She is married now to Arthur's younger brother, 18-year-old Henry, now heir apparent. And they are wed in 1509. So I know that's kind of confusing, guys. Hopefully it's not too confusing, but Catherine, now Queen of England, is the widow of the older heir apparent Arthur, who dies before he becomes king. Arthur's never king. He dies as a young man. And then Henry instead of going out and finding a new wife, takes Arthur's widow, who had never consummated her marriage with Arthur. So they're able to get a papal dispensation and see that marriage through. So that's kind of the backdrop and some of the characters. Now, one thing I see Catholics do a lot in this conversation is really belittle Henry VIII with no context. And granted, I think that in many ways Henry is an objectively bad monarch. But the fact is that he was almost our objectively bad monarch. To quote Wellington after the Battle of Waterloo, it was a damn near thing. In fact, very early on in his reign, Henry is granted the title of Defensor Fidei, the defender of the faith, for his this tract that he had written against the errors of Luther on the sacraments. So this is almost our guy, right? Like he would have been, with this one very glaring exception, he would have been remembered as a Catholic monarch had it not been for what's about to happen. Now, many of you are aware of the King's Great Matter, how Henry's failure to produce a male heir caused him great consternation, considering the tenuous position of his dynasty, which we have discussed, right? Because with the death of Richard III and with the enthronement of Henry VII, this is a new family, the Tudors. Even though the War of Roses is complex, they in their own mind, they're looking to legitimize everything. So for Henry VIII at this point, he's very much aware that for the legitimacy of his dynasty to be confirmed is the necessity of a male heir is like at the fore for him. Henry is very aware of his need for legitimacy, and he almost becomes like obsessed with this necessity of a male heir. And it does seem to give Henry kind of the, how should I say? I don't even think it's a matter of the benefit of the doubt. I think it's pretty clear that this is a real crisis for Henry. And he's not just looking at it through a secular lens. Henry was a man who believed in the divine, and he thought that this could very well be divine retribution. Said many of you are kind of familiar with the story of the King's Great Matter. But I want to focus here is on the circumstances that happen at the moment that they happen. Because while all of this is taking place, again, the context, you have reformers ever chomping at the bit to gain an upper hand in whatever state that they can. Up to this point, it would appear that England is a contender to be as far away from a candidate to fall for the errors of the reform as any other state in Europe. But in one of the most consequential moments of the entire period, Henry, in his bid to get his annulment through, brings in a relatively unknown Thomas Cranmer to take the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Now, Cranmer has made it known that he will do whatever is necessary to get Henry's annulment. Cranmer is a very shrewd man, kind of Machiavellian in some ways. He signs off on the formal papers to get the Pope's permission for this annulment, even though in this early period, Cranmer has already interiorly decided that the Pope's office was illegitimate. He had been spending time on the continent studying the reformed ideas of Luther, especially, and has become very convinced of the Reformation ideals. Now, there's a scholarly debate at just how far reformed Cranmer was at this early point, but we know that while he was studying for ordination, he married in secret, causing him to lose his fellowship at Cambridge. And in 1532, he marries again, though by that point he had taken holy orders and become a priest. As well, his brother Edmund, also a priest, was married illegally and in secret. So all of these, to me, are signs that that Thomas Cranmer is fully within the Reformed camp in this early process, at least as far as these ecclesial reforms that the Reformers are pushing for. Cranmer was in many ways a very unscrupulous man. He would, as I said, in a Machiavellian sort of way, bend his moral convictions if he thought that the outcome would be beneficial for the wider reform cause. For example, years later, when Henry VIII died, he formally comes out in public with a beard, a sign at that time of one's reforming preferences and as a married clergy. So he'd been working with Henry all of this time, yet he had been only like piecemeal introducing Reformation ideals because he knew that Henry, being the sort of conservative monarch that Henry was in many ways, that he couldn't just force this upon Henry. Yet Henry dies, and Cranmer exposes who he is quite quickly. Because he knew, like I said, with Henry, you're dealing with a man who was never quite comfortable with Luther or the evangelicals. And while there's some evidence that points to maybe Henry starting to shift a little bit towards the end of his life, becoming actually more inclined towards the Reformation, it's kind of a moot point because he dies when he dies. And again, there's scholarly debate not just about Cranmer's conversion, but also the slippage of England into the Reformation camp. Many people want to say that under Henry it was merely a schism, and that it wasn't until Edward, Henry's son, and most especially until Elizabeth, that the reform truly got underway. Men like Robert Aske and others in the staunchly Catholic North, though, saw the writing on the wall very early. And this wasn't just a schism as it was so much a schism that was nearing heresy evermore. Hence, with Robert Aske, the outbreak of the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was brought about because of changes in the 1536 10 articles, which attempted to suppress areas dealing with the cult of the saints, with teachings on purgatory, the propitiatory aspects of the Mass. Like these guys, especially up in the North, that was more staunchly Catholic, they saw the writing of the wall. They knew what was happening. They weren't dumb, but it was, like I said, all kind of a moot point because Henry dies in 1547 at a very crucial moment because his son has not come of age yet. He takes the throne, but he's just a boy, so he's basically like a regent with his ministers, getting right to work, undermining what little attempts had been made to sort of hold together Catholicism in the country. So even though it would be some time before the changes were fully implemented in the Book of Common Prayer, Cranmer was bringing in the continental reformers to England to help shape the new church basically right away, right as soon as Henry's gone. He brings in Peter Martyr Vermigli in 1547 and sets him up as the Regius Professor at Oxford. He brings in Martin Bucer in 1549 and sets him up as Regius Professor training clergy at Cambridge. So you can see, right, like Cranmer's placing these very instrumental, controversial, as far as Catholics are concerned, thinkers into key positions of religious education within the country. Remember, it was Vermigli in particular who would come to shape the English rejection of transubstantiation, taking a reform stance on the Eucharist and the Mass. And it was Bucer who helps to construct the Edwardian Ordinal, which, if we take into account, Bucer's rejection of the Mass and his acceptance of Luther's ideal of the priesthood, the die has been cast at this point. And it was actually this Ordinal that effectively undid the church in England as far as the Catholic Church would later rule, when she declares that the Anglican orders are null and void. Now, this is a controversial act by Anglo-Catholics, who we will discuss here in a moment, but consider Luther, Calvin, now Bucer, and Cranmer. These men considered the Catholic Mass an abomination. They consider it a works salvation. The Catholic teaching of transubstantiation was idolatry. Our priests were effectively involved in hocus pocus at the altar. There's some belief that actually hocus pocus was a mockery of the words at the Mass, hoc est, right? The hocus pocus, right? So it's making fun of the words of consecration. This is my body. There's an important concept in legal language that when you read comments, it's very crucial for Catholics, especially when you're reading the formulations, right, of like an ordinal, which is how the ordination is going to take place of English ministers at this point. What is the intent of the authors of that ordinal? So if the English reformers' intent in the Edwardine ordinal is not, keyword, not to do what the Catholic priest does or what the bishop does, then this is a defect in the sacrament. All the reformers publicly denied. It is their words, right? We're taking them at their word. They deny the sacrifice of the Mass. They deny transubstantiation vehemently, and they make their own priesthood, in their words, in their minds, contra to Rome. So this is not the same as with the Orthodox. We took the Anglicans at their word. Anglo-Catholics, I mean, you guys can be mad all you want about this, and like I said, we'll get to the Anglo-Catholics in a minute, but as the old saying goes, when you make your bed, you have to sleep in it. Very early on in this period, when Anglican priests were, when they would convert back to the Catholic Church, we were actually making them receive holy orders. So this was a recognition, even long before Apostolic Curiae, that Rome saw a defect in the Anglican ordination. Tragically, by the time that the ordinal was corrected, all of the living bishops in England had died, thus ending valid orders in the Anglican communion completely. So, what arguments then are the Anglo-Catholics making? Because I see a lot of Catholics confused when they're discussing or when they're dealing with an Anglo-Catholic. They don't quite know what they're dealing with. So, what happens is that in the 19th century, you have a wonderful little movement grow up in the Anglican Church centered around the Oxford University, known to us today as the Oxford Movement. The key figures of this were men like Edward Pusey, John Keble, and most famously for us, John Henry Newman. And these men begin to gain notoriety for these little tracts that they would put out that would cause quite a stir, actually, and a lot of controversy in Anglican circles of the day, because what these men were doing was they were attempting to basically reinvent, reassess, revise the Protestant Reformation in light of Catholic England's past. Let me say that again. They're attempting to revise, to revisit the history of the English Reformation through the lens of England's Catholic past. So with them, you have, even men like Edward Pusey, who never left Anglicanism. You will see an emphasis on things like confession, on things like Eucharistic adoration, for example. And this tends to confuse a lot of Catholics and honestly Protestants for that matter. It's kind of like when Protestants run into the Anglo-Catholics, they're kind of like, what in the world is, like, why are you not Roman Catholic? Where did all of this come from? But let's kind of make sense of some of the central arguments, because this is what I see missing so much in this dialogue between Catholics and Anglo-Catholics. So most consequential to all of this is the idea of what's known as branch theory, where at the center or the trunk is Christ. And moving outward, branching out, so to speak, you get the communions most closely aligned with the center, which is Christ. This being, for the Anglicans that profess this, the communions closest to Christ to the center would be the Anglicans, the Orthodox, and yes, the Roman Catholics. And this is key, guys. Don't forget this. You see, despite the events of the Reformation, which we'll get back to, these guys say, hey, it really doesn't matter so much. This is the core teachings of Christ. And depending on how close you are to those core teachings, this is where the church is. Now, as you move away from that center, from that trunk, be ye Catholic, be ye Orthodox, be ye Protestant, then you move away from the true church. So they would see some of your low church denominations and your puritanical sects further away from that center. And then even further beyond that, you would find like the Jews and the Muslims, and further beyond that, the pagans, right? So do you get that? Does that make sense? So yes, many Anglo-Catholics And this is why I think Catholics and Anglicans are often talking past each other. But many Anglo-Catholics consider you, Roman Catholics, to be part of the true church, right there with they themselves. Now, perhaps certain popes, certain reformers, certain ideas that creep in may lead astray, but the core remains Christ. And there will always be this body of believers who remain close around that core. So now you're going, okay, where does all of this come from? How do we get from Vermigli denying transubstantiation at Oxford to now having this Oxford movement saying, well, guys, it really wasn't that? We have to realize that most often Catholic interest in England ends around the death of Elizabeth into the era of James. You know, when you hear Catholics discussing the Anglicans, it's usually Henry, it's usually Elizabeth. Occasionally you'll get into James a little bit. But because of that, you lose the entire strange series of events that take place in England afterwards, like the English Civil War. And what's happening here? Well, you have Charles I, King Charles I, son of James, accused by many of being a retrograde, who seeks to return the English church to its idolatrous ways, to the point that many believe that he may have been conspiring with Rome. This was the rumors that are making the rounds. Surrounding the reign of Charles is a series of theologians known as the Caroline Divines, men like Lancelot Andrewes, Archbishop of Canterbury William Laud. That's right. We're not like talking about lowbrow theologians. We're talking about all the way up to the highest offices of the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury Laud. Many Anglo-Catholics consider Laud a martyr since he died defending certain ancient customs of the English Church against the puritanical innovations of Cromwell in Pym's Parliament. Henry Hammond, who sought to interpret the 39 Articles in light of the Catholic pre-Reformation traditions. So this is all after Elizabeth, after the reforms, but before the Oxford movement. And they're looking at this period, the Oxford movement guys see this as something of a precedence. They look at this period of almost restoration. And again, to quote Wellington, it was a damn near thing. What a lot of you guys don't realize is that the monarchy, Cromwell comes in with the English Civil War, beheads Charles, monarchy's abolished. Cromwell becomes Lord Protectorate. When he dies, there's a restoration of the monarchy. And James II, after Charles II, who was very sympathetic to the Catholic Church, James II himself was a Catholic. So you had a Catholic monarchy take the crown, and we almost had a reunion with Rome. But alas, you get the so-called Glorious Revolution, and the English Church from this point forward forbade a Catholic to ever take the throne of England. Now look, it's a laudable thing, pun intended, to see Anglicans make overtures towards Rome and to attempt to fix the errors of the Reformation. But the Oxford movement, I believe, has been rightly criticized by both Catholics and Protestants. The biggest detractors of the Oxford movement were actually Anglicans, fellow Anglicans. Catholic and Orthodox, though, we basically say it's sort of a null movement because we reject the branch theory of the church. And just to be, it would derail going into why we rejected it. But just keep in mind, we rejected it. But also, the Protestants, as I said, saw the Oxford movement as a very subversive attempt to Romanize what they saw as the right and legitimate reforms of the English Reformation. And we Catholics actually agree with the Protestant, the more reformed Protestants of the Anglican Church on this fact. In fact, one of the greatest proponents of the Oxford movement, John Henry Newman, after writing his last infamous Tract 90, came to the conclusion himself that this position was untenable, in many regards because of the arguments his fellow Anglicans made at him. In Tract 90, he was attempting to conform the 39 Articles with traditional Catholic doctrine And he saw that it was a rightly insurmountable contradiction at key points. Now, sadly, the Oxford movement effectively died off as a real force as a result of his conversion, but it did survive in pockets up to this very day. And again, I admire and I understand the Anglican Catholic desire to want to be in communion with us. I want them in communion with us too. But the real problem with the Oxford movement is that it fails to truly justify the Reformation in a way that wasn't a split, a true split between the two communions, not just a schism, but in matters of faith. The reformers, I think, meant what they said, and that's not without its real and serious consequences. So it's because of this that we don't commune with the Anglicans to this very day. Now, there have been some suggestions that by way of introduction of certain Old Catholic Church priests into the Anglican Communion, that this reintroduces valid, if illicit, orders into the Anglicans. Maybe so. It remains to be seen. But you know, a bunch of you out there I know really like, for example, like Father Calvin Robinson. And granted, his speech at Oxford was very well presented when he first sort of showed up on the scene. But you have to realize that when he says he'd become Catholic if Pope Benedict the 16th were still alive, but he won't under any conditions become Catholic under Francis. He's coming from this Oxford movement branch theory belief that the Roman Catholic Church is effectively no different than the Anglican Church, with the exception that this or that bishop may or may not be closer to the central hub of Christ. So he believes that Benedict the 16th was and Francis isn't. And therefore he gets to kind of cherry pick which, if he's going to be in communion with the Catholic Church. But as we all know, the Catholic Church is a bouncing ball where it's like, okay, now it's closer to Christ, now it isn't. Now it's closer to Christ, now it isn't. The way that the Catholic Church sees itself, and that's why I said you're dealing with two different vantage points here, and that's why I think we often talk past one another. The Catholic Church says that we, based on the keys given to Peter, have a unique privilege and prerogatives of the papacy that aren't sort of that arbitrary as the Oxford movement would have it be. Now, of course, a good Anglican Catholic believes in branch theory, would see, for example, our Anglican ordinariate as sheep stealing, as a subversive attempt. But I think that this is actually just being in conformity with, and I've got my criticisms of the ordinariate as what it's the fruits of it, which I don't want to get into today because I don't want to upset. Like again, I love that there are Anglicans that want to be in communion with Rome, and I'm not trying to like upset you guys. The only problem that I would have with it was the means by which the Anglican ordinariate attempted to resolve a problem that I think needs greater, to give, I think, actually the Anglo-Catholics credit here, the ones that are still out of communion with the Anglican Church. There's actually some problems that need to be resolved. And I get, right, like Rome is very pastoral. It wants to sort of open up that door and allow these people to come in. Sometimes warts and all. I hate to put it any other way, to let them come into the church, but that the Anglican ordinariate is Benedict the 16th being consistent with what the Catholics actually believe about this situation. We're not looking at it from the vantage point that of branch theory, where we're all, closer to that central trunk of Christ. It's that the Roman Church has a unique privilege and prerogative to be the effectively the one true church. So that's kind of what I have for you guys today. I don't see any questions. I see someone named Zanatax saying good morning. Good morning to you. There's some more things I would want to say about this, but I feel like it would just take way too long and it would kind of derail the conversation way too much. But I wanted to keep this one kind of about what the early period of the Reformation stood for and why it was a problem later, and why, for example, John Henry Newman came to the conclusion that it was a problem. And what I plan to do next time, it won't be next week, but it'll be the following week, is we're going to be covering some of the theology of St. John Scotus and St. John Henry Newman, both Oxford men, both English in that sense, even though Scotus was actually quite possibly a Scotsman or an Irishman, but still trained in Oxford, so coming from the same tradition. I think once we sort of compare and contrast these two great thinkers of the English tradition, we can get a sense of what I believe is actually the truer, more authentic Catholic tradition as it pertains to the English Church. I will say that there are many points of agreement that I could find with the Anglo-Catholics, but there's also points of agreement. By this I mean agreement in, like, we believe in things like adoration, right? We believe in things like confession. There are certain things that we hold to be in similar truths. At the same time, I agree with the more reformed minded Anglicans of the fact that the Reformation was real and it had real consequences, and those consequences are substantial. And I think that in many ways, those more reform minded Anglicans would agree with the Roman Church that we don't, that there's quite a bit of a like bitterness about the decree from the Catholic Church that the Anglican orders are null and void from the Anglo-Catholics. But again, it's this, you're trying to, like, as an Anglo-Catholic, put yourself in the position of a Roman Catholic, right? And we're looking back and we're trying to say, okay, these now there's okay, let me not derail. I can remember that thought. There's the Roman Catholic position, which is that we're taking the reformers at their word. They meant to undo this. They meant to say that the Roman Mass is an abomination. There's actually oaths that it's an Englishman that you had to take, which denies transubstantiation. These were all times government oaths, certainly religious oaths. You had to deny the, this is not, and I've heard a Anglican priest say before, well, things kind of were cleared up after Trent, when Trent sort of like made clear some of its teachings on transubstantiation. Well, this doesn't deny the fact that even after Trent in England for a long time, you had to take oaths against transubstantiation. So even once we qualified as Catholics after Trent, the Anglicans didn't say, okay, yeah, no, we get it now, right? Like, you still, as a Catholic, you would have to reject, to take some kind of like government job, you would have to reject transubstantiation. This is like a huge problem as far as Catholics are concerned when we're saying, what is the intent of the Anglican minister? Now, Anglo-Catholics, I've heard one of the complaints was that, well, at the time of Pope Leo the 13th, there's like certain pressures to deny the Anglican communion, and so it was like a political stunt, basically, to say that their orders are null and void. But if you're going to make that argument, like if that's your sort of epistemological framework, is that political intrigue? I'm not granting that this actually was. I actually do think that Leo the 13th was quite devastated by the final results, that the orders were null and void. I think he actually did want to find that there was a chance it would make the whole process of coming back into communion that much more easier. But if that's your framework, right, that, okay, well, political intrigue therefore negates true authentic doctrine, then you've basically undermined all of Catholic doctrine, going all the way back to, let's say, all of Catholic doctrine. Like, there wasn't political intrigue at Chalcedon. There wasn't political intrigue at Nicaea. Like, there's no point in church history where doctrine has been formulated, or decrees have been, canons have been passed, or where there wasn't some kind of political intrigue involved. So Champagne Future here says, would they be open to conditional ordination? By they, do you mean would the Catholic Church be open to conditional ordination, or by the, kind of depends on who you ask. I I don't think, with as far as when a pre and this would be good for somebody that's more of an expert on this, when, as far as the proper ordination goes, when an Anglican priest wants to become a Catholic, I do think that they actually, it's not like a conditional baptism, for example, if that's kind of what you're getting at. It's actually, they go through the process of ordination because Now, this might get if you're if you're thinking of how should I put this? If you're thinking about like the issue with the old Orthodox Church, I don't know. I'm sure there's probably people in Rome that are aware of this, but the last that I know that was sort of a high level statement comes from Benedict the 16th when he was listing certain things that were like infallible teachings of the church. He lists apostolicae curiae in there as, when they said that the Anglican orders were null and void, at least as far as what they were looking at going back to that Adorning Ordinal, that it's pretty much a settled discussion. Now, again, Benedict the 16th at that point was not considering the old Catholic church and those ordinations. That would have to be revisited. But at this point, I don't think it's conditional. I think they actually have to go through the entire process of becoming an ordained priest. So, anyways, guys, that's what I got for you this time. I hope you enjoyed. I plan to, like I said, not the I've got a few things about the English church that I want to touch upon because, I have a deep love for Scotus. I have a deep love for St. John Henry Newman and the teachings of these guys. And I think I want to, in my own small little way, in my own corner of the internet, be a part of sort of a revitalization of the Catholic tradition from the English church in a way that I don't think that unfortunately, I think that the Anglican Catholics, and this is why I'm not really going to go into it too much. I think aesthetically they bring a lot of the traditional church back with them. I don't think they necessarily bring it theologically, and that would be a whole nother conversation. It's a diverse group, though. I'm not saying this is across the board, right? There's a very diverse group of people, and I love my Anglican ordinary brothers and sisters, so don't get me wrong there. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time. God bless you all.